On September 13, 1940, a German bomb hit Buckingham Palace while King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were inside. The Queen Mother's response has become the most quoted line in her entire life. "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face." It's a perfect sentence. Too perfect. And the question your audience keeps asking is simple. Was she brave, or was she performing? Here's what I think. Wrong question. But to understand why it's the wrong question, you need to know what was happening in London 6 days before those bombs hit the palace. Because the quote doesn't make any sense without it. September 7th, 1940. 350 Luftwaffe bombers hammered the East End of London in a single afternoon and evening. Stepney, Poplar, Bermondsey, West Ham, the Isle of Dogs. These weren't accidents of geography. The docks sat along the Thames, and German pilots flying in from the Channel hit them first. But the people living in those streets weren't strategic infrastructure. They were families, packed into terraced houses with no cellars, no private shelters, huddling in Anderson shelters in tiny back gardens, while the sky turned orange above them. In that first week alone, over 400 Londoners died. The vast majority were working-class East Enders. And here's the detail that turns a war story into a class story. While the East End was being pounded nightly, Mayfair and Belgravia, the wealthy neighborhoods a few miles west, remained largely untouched. The resentment was instant, vocal, dangerous. Mass observation researchers recorded the fury. Harold Nicholson, the diplomat and MP, noted the class tension in his diary with visible alarm. In one incident that sounds almost too dramatic to be real, a group of East Enders, led by communist organizers, stormed the basement shelter of the Savoy Hotel on the Strand, demanding to know why the wealthy had deep, reinforced shelters while working families had corrugated tin. The anger wasn't abstract. It was specific, it was justified, and it was aimed upward. Which brings us to the moment that most accounts of the Queen Mother's wartime heroism conveniently skip. When King George VI and Queen Elizabeth made one of their earliest visits to the bombed East End in those opening days of the Blitz, they weren't greeted with grateful deference. They were booed. The King and Queen of England stood in the rubble of shattered working-class streets and heard their own people's contempt. Picture that. Picture Elizabeth, impeccably dressed, smiling her practiced smile, hearing jeers from people who just lost their homes, while Buckingham Palace stood gleaming and untouched a few miles west. She could not look the East End in the face. She knew it. And that knowledge is the invisible engine behind everything that happened on September 13th. So let's talk about September 13th. The morning was gray, overcast. The King and Queen were at the palace. Their daughters, Princess Elizabeth, 14, and Princess Margaret, 10, had already been sent to Windsor Castle when the bombing started. The King and Queen themselves kept using the palace as a working base during the week, sometimes retreating to Windsor in the evenings. Not quite the full-time residential defiance that popular myth suggests, but genuinely dangerous. The palace is a massive, unmissable target sitting at the end of the mall, and the Blitz didn't care about your postcode. What happened that morning, though? That wasn't random. A single German bomber broke through the cloud cover and flew straight up the mall at low altitude. Not over Whitehall, not toward the docks. Up the Mall, the broadest, most ceremonial avenue in London, using it as a flight path aimed directly at the palace. You don't accidentally fly a bomber down the most famous street in the British Empire toward the most recognizable building on it. The pilot descended, followed the line of the mall like it was a runway, and released his bombs in what can only be described as a deliberate attack on the royal residence. Elizabeth described the next few seconds in a letter she wrote to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, later that same day. A letter that sat in the royal archives for decades, before William Shawcross published it in his 2009 biography. She and the king were in their private sitting room on the first floor, overlooking the inner quadrangle. They heard the roar of an engine. Too close, too loud. They went to the window. They saw the bomber, and then they watched the bombs fall. Two people, standing at a window, watching objects arc through the air toward them, knowing in the space of a breath what those objects were. Having no time to do anything but watch. The bomb struck the quadrangle 30 yards from where they stood. 30 yards, the length of a cricket pitch and a half. 6 bombs hit the palace in that single attack. 2 in the quadrangle, 2 in the forecourt, 1 in the garden, and 1 that struck the royal chapel. The chapel wasn't damaged. It was destroyed, comprehensively wrecked, reduced to rubble that would never be rebuilt in its original form. The water main was severed. Windows throughout the palace were blown in by the blast wave, and a member of the palace staff was killed. Several others were seriously wounded. These aren't the details of a symbolic inconvenience. A man died. Shrapnel tore through rooms the king and queen could easily have been occupying. Had the trajectory shifted 20 or 30 yards in any direction, the monarchy, and arguably the trajectory of the entire war, might have been rewritten in a single morning. This wasn't an isolated event either. Buckingham Palace was hit 16 times over the course of the war, according to a JSTOR-published academic study of air raids in Britain. 16. The first incident had come just 5 days earlier, on September 8th, when a delayed action bomb landed in the palace grounds. But September 13th was the most dangerous, the most direct, and, crucially, the most narratively useful. And that word, narratively, is where things get complicated. Because what happened next was both completely human and impossibly polished. The standard version of the quote, the one hardened into legend. "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." But the New York Times, in her 2002 obituary, rendered it differently. "I am almost glad we have been bombed." Almost. That single word transforms the quote from a press release into something messier, more human, more like what a person in shock might actually say. The World History Encyclopedia records yet another version. "Now I feel we can look the East End in the face." The Today Show reported it as the ability to now look the East End in the face. Slight variations, different phrasings, and those variations are actually the most persuasive evidence that the remark was, at its origin, spontaneous. Because rehearsed lines don't drift between retellings, they're fixed. These shifted like something remembered from conversation, not read from a card. So who did she say it to? This is the question every standard account glides right past, and it's the one that matters most. The primary evidence is that letter to Queen Mary written that same day. The "glad we've been bombed" sentiment appears in private family correspondence, not a pronouncement to journalists, not a statement from the palace steps. A remark to one's mother-in-law carries different evidentiary weight than a press conference. It suggests genuine feeling. But here's the thing. Private remarks made by queens don't remain private by accident, particularly when they're this good. Buckingham Palace in 1940 didn't have the professionalized press operation of later decades, but it wasn't operating in a media vacuum. There was a palace press secretary, and looming over every aspect of Britain's public wartime narrative stood the Ministry of Information, the government body responsible for propaganda and morale, which controlled newsreel access, shaped newspaper coverage, and actively constructed the story of British resilience for domestic and international audiences. The royal family's Blitz experience was a propaganda asset of extraordinary value. It would have been bizarre, indeed professionally negligent, for the ministry and the palace not to have ensured those words reached the widest possible audience. The quote appeared in British newspapers within days. It circulated with a speed and fervor, suggesting it landed at precisely the right emotional frequency. Someone, Elizabeth herself, a palace aide, a ministry handler, understood that this particular sentence was too valuable to stay private. The chain from private remark to public legend was very short. Someone made sure of that. Now, does that mean she didn't mean it? Number. Does it mean she was performing? Not exactly. What it means is that she was the kind of person who could feel something real and simultaneously recognize its public utility. And if you think that's contradictory, you've never met a politician, or a priest, or frankly, anyone who's ever had to lead people through a crisis. The quote drew its power from a prior decision, the decision to stay in London at all. There'd been genuine pressure to evacuate. Advisors urged the King and Queen to relocate. Windsor, Balmoral, even Canada. Elizabeth's response to the suggestion has itself become famous. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the King. And the King will never leave." 3 parallel clauses building to a climax. Another perfect sentence. You see the pattern, right? The context makes the decision both braver and more strategically obvious than the heroic version allows. When Germany invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, Queen Wilhelmina fled to London. King Haakon VII of Norway escaped after the German invasion. Both had legitimate reasons. Their countries were physically overrun. But their departures created an implicit contrast with any monarch who chose to remain. George VI and Elizabeth understood, whether instinctively or through explicit discussions with Churchill, that leaving London while the East End burned was politically unsurvivable. Churchill met the King weekly and was a close ally in shaping the royal couple's wartime posture. Staying was the brave choice. It was also the only viable one. Both things true, neither canceling the other. And then came the visits. After September 13th, the King and Queen dramatically increased their trips to bombed neighborhoods across London, particularly the battered East End. Photographers were present. Newsreel cameras rolled as the royals picked through rubble, spoke with families who'd lost everything, inspected the wreckage of schools and churches. Elizabeth's wardrobe became a weapon. She pointedly refused to dress down. While visiting neighborhoods where families were sleeping in shelters, she appeared in her customary pastels, pale blue, lilac, ivory, with hats, pearls, and heels. Her reasoning offered in yet another exquisitely polished line. "If they came to see me, they would put on their best clothes, so I must do the same for them." Her designer, Norman Hartnell, reportedly chose the soft colors specifically because they'd stand out in photographs and newsreels. Pale against gray rubble, she was visible. She was unmistakable. She looked like hope, walking through a disaster zone. The Ministry of Information coordinated these visits, arranged photographers, distributed the coverage. This was wartime, and morale was a strategic resource as fuel or ammunition. But, and this is critical, none of that means the visits were insincere. The King and Queen went to places that were genuinely dangerous. Unstable structures, unexploded ordnance, the ever-present risk of another raid. Accounts from East Enders who met the Queen describe real warmth, unscripted kindness, moments of emotional connection that no press handler could have manufactured. But the cameras were always there. The images were curated. The story was shaped. Performance and sincerity occupied the same physical space at the same moment, and the attempt to separate them into neat categories is an exercise in missing the point entirely. Here's the emotional payoff. The booing stopped. After the palace was bombed, after the visits became regular, After the East End understood the royal family was genuinely enduring the Blitz alongside them, the hostility melted away, replaced by something approaching real affection. Crowds cheered, children were presented, hands were shaken. The monarchy's standing in the most deprived corners of London climbed higher than it had been in living memory. The "glad we've been bombed" quote wasn't just a good line. It was a promissory note. The East End visits were the payment. And here's what makes Elizabeth Bowe's lion genuinely fascinating rather than simply admirable or simply cynical. She understood this. All of it. She understood that the promissory note needed to be issued and the payment needed to be made. And she understood that both the issuing and the paying required her to actually show up in dangerous places and actually care about the people she met. Because the British public can smell a fake at 40 paces, and the East End of London could smell one at 10. She wasn't born royal. She'd married into the job. She'd spent the years since the abdication rebuilding a monarchy that her brother-in-law had cracked with his selfishness. She'd charmed the American press corps during the 1939 North American tour, photographed smiling and engaging with ordinary citizens in a manner that British royals had rarely attempted. She was warm where George was stiff, effortless where he was effortful. By September 1940, she'd already demonstrated, repeatedly, unmistakably, that she understood how to manage an image. She leveraged September 13th for the rest of her life. That's not an accusation. That's an observation. The Blitz goodwill became the foundation of her public identity for 60 years. When she died in March 2002, at the age of 101, the tributes circled back to the same place every time. The bombing, the quote, the East End visits. Her funeral coverage invoked the Blitz as the defining chapter of her life. When critics occasionally raised questions about her lavish lifestyle, her legendary appetite for entertaining and horse racing, or her rumored overdraft at Coutts Bank, the Blitz was the shield that deflected every blow. How dare you question a woman who stayed when the bombs fell? She understood that this shield existed. She maintained it. She polished it, and she was right to, because it was built on something real. So, was she brave, or was she performing? She was standing 30 yards from a bomb blast that killed a man, and her first instinct was to find the sentence that would turn a near-death experience into a bridge between the crown and its angriest subjects. She was genuine enough to stay when she could have run, and strategic enough to make sure everyone knew she'd stayed. She was terrified, you'd have to be, and composed enough to write a letter to her mother-in-law that same afternoon, in which the terror is filtered through wit, understatement, and an unmistakable awareness of her own story. The bravery was real, the performance was real, and the genius, the thing that made that quote survive for 80 years, was that she understood something most people never figure out. In a moment of national crisis, performing courage is a form of courage. The people in the East End didn't need her to feel their pain privately. They needed her to show up, in pale blue, with a perfect sentence, and mean it. She did all of those things simultaneously. The quote endured not because it was spontaneous, and not because it was calculated. It endured because it was the exact right thing to say at the exact right moment. And she was the kind of person who could find that sentence while the dust was still settling and the glass was still falling. You don't have to pick a side. She didn't. If you found this story more interesting than you expected, subscribe for more like it.